Hey guys, so today we are going to be looking at world domination. So really we're just going to be looking at the who was colonized versus who were the colonizers, okay? So I know that we've touched on some of this stuff just briefly in the past, and I know you probably have some background knowledge from maybe middle school, but today we're going to look at that more in depth. So, for the most part, our colonizers are going to be the European countries. Okay, so they're pretty much going to be the top dogs, and they were really throughout history, and so they are going to have a lot of colonies all over the world, especially in Africa and Asia. But before they really kind of started that expansion, they went westward, right? That's how they ended up here in the Western Hemisphere, and they colonized in South America and Central America before they really kind of started off, or they set off to the other side of the world. And because of that, when they went to the Western Hemisphere, so basically, so Central America, South America, when they held those colonies, that was like early in colonization. And so most of those countries in Latin America gained their independence in the 18th or the 19th century, so aka the 1700s, right, or the 1800s, all right, which is really going to be on the early side of what we are going to be talking through the rest of this video, okay? So Latin America and the Western Hemisphere was really colonized first, so that's earlier in history. You'll notice that your notes are kind of broken down into who, what, when, where, why, how, all of that. So the what that we are focusing on today is colonialism and imperialism. And sometimes those terms are used interchangeably, but there is a difference. So colonialism refers to when a country or a power will move into a new place and take control over a new place that is sparsely inhabited. Really, that just means that there's not a lot of people there. Okay, there might be some, but specifically, like in the Western Hemisphere, there weren't a whole lot of people here. Remember, think like 13 colonies. Remember when the Pilgrims came, right, and we had Jamestown that started in 1607, right? You learned about all of that in American history, but that was called colonialism because there wasn't a large established population that was here in North America before they got here. Yes, there were Indians, but it was sparsely inhabited. Okay, so there weren't just a whole lot of people here, and so that's why we were considered colonialism from Great Britain, right? Because we were the colonies. So it wasn't considered imperialism. We were just the colonies. The difference is that when imperialism happens, this is where there are already people living there, okay? So it might be more organized groups of people living there, but there's a larger population living in that place that is being overtaken, okay? So either way, it says down here that domination is going to take over in all of these different aspects, okay? So either with colonialism or imperialism is greatly going to change the way life is going to look in that place that's being overtaken. The when is also pretty important here. It kind of breaks up the difference between colonialism and imperialism. So when we're thinking about back in history, colonialism is what's going to happen first because the Europeans, this is when the Europeans set off westward, right? Because they thought that they were going to get to Asia, right? But they didn't end up in Asia. Where did they end up? They ended up in the Caribbean, right? And so this happened in the 1400s. So that was early on, like right when the explorers started taking off. So that's going to be considered colonialism. more so in the Western Hemisphere because there wasn't like large populations over here yet. And so colonialism happens pretty much like during 1400s, 1500s, 1600s. Okay, so that's earlier. Second, we have imperialism. Okay, so imperialism is going to happen around 1800s into early 1900s. And so this is when, we're going to talk about this in a little bit, but this is when Europe starts to divide up Africa especially and Southeast Asia, and they start like claiming all of this land. But in those places there were already lots of people established there, and so it's considered imperialism. But typically that's going to happen later, like in the 1800s and then early 1900s. Okay, so here's a map. I know on my video it looks a little bit grainy, but if you open up the presentation, you'll be able to see this map a lot clearer. But this is a map of what colonization and imperialism in particular, looks like, okay? So you can see all of the different colors, right? And you can also notice that Latin America, so all of this is grayed out. All right, that's because we had moved on at that point, and these countries had gained their independence. And so this is like late 1800s. Okay, so the Berlin Conference I have up here happened in 1884 to 1885. The Berlin Conference was really important. So this is when European countries gathered, and they decided that Africa down here was this really big resource that they wanted to access. There were a lot of like natural resources there, minerals and all sorts of stuff. And so the European countries got together and they decided that they were just going to carve up Africa. Decided to carve up Africa, okay? And when they did this, they really didn't take into consideration the people that were already living there. So I know that we've talked about this before, but Africa has a lot of different ethnicities, a lot of different groups, a lot of different nations. Remember learning about that last week? There's a lot of different nations or groups of people that have lived in Africa for a really long time. And so in the 1800s, there were tribal groups spread out all through Africa, but basically the European countries got together, they laid down a map of Africa, and they just started drawing lines all across Africa. Okay, and so you can see that today in a lot of like the straight lines that are drawn in Africa, right? You see straight line, straight line, straight line, straight line, straight line. It's just straight lines in a lot of places, okay? Because they thought that it would be easiest just to divide it up how they saw fit without regards to the groups of people that were already living there, okay? And so a lot of this imperialism happened in Africa. You can see that because of all the different colors that are there in Africa, right? And you can tell which countries are down there based on all of like the key at the bottom with all of our colors, right? And you can notice that there's a lot of green, right? Green is the United Kingdom. I'm sure you've heard at some point that the sun never set on the British Empire, right? Have you heard that kind of saying before? That really just means that at some point in the world, the sun was rising, right? It was daytime at some point or at some place in the British Empire. So all of these green countries that you see was owned by Great Britain, this tiny little island, right? But we know that they were super powerful throughout history. Okay, so lots of green. Great Britain had a lot of that. Another color that you see a lot of is the light blue color, right, in Africa, and some over here in Southeast Asia. This is France, right? France is going to be pretty powerful too. Other colors that you might see, there's a lot of purple, right? And purple is Russia. And so we know that Russia had a very strong what's the word I'm looking for? A strong influence over a lot of Asia and Eastern Europe, right? You can see that here, that Russia, aka the Soviet Union, had a lot of control in Eastern Europe and in a lot of Asia. Okay, so that's why they're pretty powerful. And then the last thing is the Ottoman Empire, okay, which is the orange you can see here in the Middle East, right? So that was one of the longest running empires that stayed in contact the longest throughout history. And so that is going to be kind of like your typical like Arabic and Muslim empire. Okay, that's why Arabic is still spoken and Islam was spread during this time, okay, because again, it's still very strong in that region today, and it has ties in history through to the Ottoman Empire. Okay, so this is just a good map to show you where everything was taking place. All right. And so you can see all of the different colors from all of the different countries that kind of carved up Africa, and Berlin Conference being really important there. Okay, now we're going to talk about the hows, all right? So for these first couple, we've already kind of previewed this. If you will remember our big map that we did in the last marking period with language and religion. Remember, we drew several things on our big map that relates specifically to colonialism and imperialism, okay? So take a look at these 10 most influential languages in the world. Influential just means not most important, but easily influenced, or a lot of people will speak these languages, okay? So you have English as number one, right? French, Spanish, Russian, Arabic, Chinese, German, Japanese, Brazilian Portuguese, and Hindi, okay? So think about why these languages are so dominant. And I want you to think back to the map that we just looked at on the other page, okay? On the slide before this one. Let's go through and look at how many of these languages come out of Europe, okay? We have English, right? Because English came from the United Kingdom. French, Spanish, German, Portuguese, right? We also talked about how Russia had a large purple. Remember how big and purple that was on the map before, right? Because Russia had a large expanse of countries that they were over, right? So Russian, those countries spoke Russian, right? And then we talked about how the Ottoman Empire, which was the orange on the map from before, spread pretty wide too, okay? So out of all of those, and we didn't even talk about Japan on the last slide either, because Japan was in red and they had like Northeast Asia, okay? They had colonies like in North and South Korea around that peninsula as well, okay? So almost all of these languages are dominant today, and they also were very dominant in colonizing the world, right? So all of these languages were colonizers, right? They were inserting themselves and spreading their language. Remember back to our big map that we did from the last unit, and we specifically looked at how English was spreading. Remember, we talked about historical factors, and we talked a lot about how Great Britain had spread English throughout the world. That's how we ended up speaking English today, right? And then we also looked at how in modern times and present times, because the U.S. has so much influence over other countries in the world today, that's also why English is spreading, right? Because a lot of the times it's used in business as that kind of common denominator, right? So all of these, or most of these languages were spread because of colonialism, and they were the colonizers. They were the ones who were taking over other parts of the world and teaching those new people, those new inhabitants that they were over, they were teaching them their language. Okay, so that's reason number one. Okay, the second way European countries dominated was through their religion. Remember, we also did this on our big map back in the other unit as well. But remember specifically that Europe is pretty much Christian, right? Remember how many purple arrows we drew on our map from the last time about Christianity? We talked about how when the Europeans started colonizing other places, a big reason that they did it was so that they could spread their religion, right? And in Europe, it was Christianity. That was their religion. And so they were concerned about spreading their religion to other places, remember? And so that's how it got to the U.S. Originally, that's how it got to South America and Latin America, because that's where they went first, right? But then when they started imperialism, and when the Europeans carved up Africa, they tried to take their religion there as well. And so we know that today most of northern Africa, right, is Islam, and so Christianity did not stick whenever the Europeans had broken up Africa. But in sub-Sahara Africa, which is all of this area down here, they carved up the countries, and then they started influencing, the Europeans started influencing these tribal groups with their Christian religion, right? And so you can see that today, that Christianity, we know that Christianity is one of the largest religions, right, in the world. And so that all really started because of colonization, because the Europeans took their religion with them to be missionary based. Remember, they're trying to make people convert to their religion. And so they did that when they started taking over other countries in the world. Okay, so another way the Europeans left a mark on the rest of the world is politically. Okay, so this map is actually pretty cool, and this is truly just showing global freedom. So this is a map of countries that are free, partly free, or not free. All right, so all the ones that you see in green are free. The ones that you see in yellow are partly free. And the ones that you see in purple are not free. Okay, so in this terms, okay, it kind of goes hand in hand with the lesson that you should have looked at a couple of days ago through government types, okay? And so if we're looking at the different types of government, we know that countries that are free are typically more democratic, or they might be like a constitutional monarchy, right? It's where people have the freedom to elect representatives, right? They have some sort of say in their government. And so that's what you see in all of these green countries on the map, that 44% are, it says down here that 44% are considered free, okay? So that's not even half of the countries in the world that are free. It's only 89 countries. That's not very many at all, okay? And then it says partly free. Oh, that's not, is it 20%? Yeah, it is 20%. 20% were partly free. So partly free is what you see on the map that's in yellow. You might say, well, how can a country be partly free? It might be a situation where people might get to vote, but there might be some stipulations there where the party in charge might be corrupt a little bit, or might have more control over like who gets to vote, or maybe the election process a little bit. Okay, so those countries are partly free, and if we look at that, if we look at our yellow countries, there are some over here in the Western Hemisphere with Mexico and Bolivia, all right, in the Western Hemisphere, but a lot of them are over here in Africa, right, and in Southeast Asia. Okay, now I'm moving on. Then is our purple countries, right? The ones that are not free, and that's 26% of the world. Are countries that are not free, which is just a lot. That's a large percentage of the world that does not have freedom really at all. So politically, that means, think about the government types that we learned about the other day. This could mean that they're under like an absolute monarchy, or that it could be like a dictatorship, right? We looked at dictatorships, which is not a good thing at all. Or oligarchies. Remember, oligarchies are those that are ruled by just a few people, and there's not much freedom or representation of the whole country, okay, of all of the people. And so if we look at this, there are a lot of purple countries, right, that are in the world. And if we look specifically, here we are in Africa again, right? And some over here in the Middle East, or not the Middle East, Southeast Asia, and a lot in the Middle East, because remember we talked about the other day how there are several theocracies, which is when a country is ruled by like religious ideas, right, and leaders. A lot of the times that's happening in the Middle East here. But if we're going back and we're thinking about how all of this relates to colonialism, I want us to think about Africa. Okay, so if we're looking here at Africa, right, Africa is, I mean, you tell me, are they free or are they not? The answer is really no, right? And then I want us to also look again over here in Southeast Asia, okay? So both of these places, Southeast Asia and Africa, this is where Europe really divided up the countries, okay? They started carving up Africa, right? They got into Southeast Asia, and they divided up these countries because they wanted territory, okay? But the way that they eventually left like 100 years later or so, whatever that was. They all kind of pulled out at different times. But when those European countries left Africa and left Southeast Asia, they just kind of really up and left. And they didn't really give any guidance or help to the countries of Africa and to the countries of Southeast Asia. Okay, they just kind of like, okay, see you later, we're leaving, like, have your freedom. But there was no help along the way to help these countries become established and form governments that would be able to take care of their people well. Okay, and so when that happened, when the Europeans left, they really left the African countries and the Southeast Asian countries to fend for themselves. And so when that happens, typically you'll have maybe a small group of people or maybe one person really kind of step up and take over by force. And so it's typically not like democratic at all. You know how we talk about how we have freedom to vote on our in our elections. That wasn't really the case for African countries and for Southeast Asian countries after the Europeans left. Usually it was just some guy, like some person or some small group of people decided that they were going to be in control of their newly formed country. And so there is a lot of just shady things going on. And so that could look like a dictatorship or oligarchies. And so that's why a lot of Africa and Southeast Asia is considered either partly free or not free at all, because when the Europeans left, they just left it very unstable for these countries without much help to figure out how to become democratic, and they didn't know how to do that on their own. And so that's when a few people or one person just kind of took over and said, I'm like, follow me, I'm going to be the leader. And so that's why some of these countries are still very poor today. A lot of these countries are either LDCs or NICs, and what's holding them back is really their political factions, because they don't have strong leadership and it's not very free there. All right, the last way that the Europeans overtook a lot of these countries was economically. All right, and so we know that Europe is mostly MDCs, right? We were just kind of talking about that on the last slide, and that a lot of the countries that they colonized or dominated are still today LDCs down here, right? And over here in Southeast Asia, some of these are NICs coupled with LDCs as well. Okay, so when this happened, a reason why the Europeans wanted to carve up the rest of the world was because that they wanted their resources, and so they exploited or they used the LDCs. Okay, so they were just really using them for what they had to really make money off of them. And so what that has done to countries today, so think present world, everybody is independent, right? There's no more colonization, but those countries today were really kind of crippled because there wasn't help establishing their own individual like economies. And so remember, think back to our very first unit, how LDCs typically are doing primary activities. Remember, forestry, fishing, mining, farming, stuff like that. And so these countries are now only exporting single items. So that means they might be really good at farming cotton, right? Or they might have some minerals that they can export, or they might have oil or natural gas, okay, which is some of the countries like down here in Southeast Asia. But they haven't maybe developed their economies enough to learn how to make more from that. So they're just focused on making money from these resources instead of moving them through to secondary activities, right, which would bring in more money for a country, or tertiary, quaternary levels of activities, which brings in the most money for countries. So LDCs and some NICs, because of colonization, which is a lot of these countries that you see in bright orange and red, you can see the red means that they are 80% to 100% are exporting just like one item, okay? And that's where they're making most of their money off of, which is just not as healthy as a country should be. That's not going to make them a lot of money. And so economically, the Europeans have really hindered these countries that they overtook, and then they left and kind of again left them to figure it out on their own. And so those countries have not developed as fast because they haven't had much help. So again, the ways that the Europeans diffused their culture was through language, religion, politics, and economics, okay? And with all of those things, that's how they were able to get their culture to other parts of the world, and that's why we still see a strong tie to the European colonies in those other parts of the world today. All right, so you might be wondering, well, why did the European colonies want to colonize in the first place, okay? Why did they want to overtake other parts of the world? And so that's what we're going to talk about here, okay? So there's six big reasons, I guess, that kind of encouraged the Europeans to go find other places to kind of dominate. The first one is that they needed an outlet for their population. So this means that they were just maybe wanting to expand beyond their smaller borders that they had in Europe. Okay, so I want you to think about how Australia was used as a prison colony, right? I think we've talked about that before, right? And so Great Britain wanted to get rid of their growing inmate population, and so they decided to go take over Australia and just send all of their prisoners to Australia. Another reason, also again with Great Britain, think about the U.S., right? They sent people to the 13 colonies, right? Because they wanted maybe some different religious freedom, but still they were able to go get that land, and so they were able to spread their population beyond their borders. Okay, so that's the first reason. The second reason is that they wanted to be self-sufficient. I know that's kind of a big word, but really they just wanted to have and create and make everything on their own. Okay, so they didn't want to have to rely on trade at all. They didn't want to have to pay other countries or other places for resources that they needed to make stuff. Okay, so you have to think that textiles, the Industrial Revolution was happening, right, and during this time period, and so there were factories, and so production started to increase, and they needed to make, and they wanted to make more things, but that meant they had to have more materials, and they might not have had everything that they needed in the European countries. So they went out looking for other places that had maybe natural resources, okay, that they could overtake and use those resources and not have to pay for it, okay? And so this is really typical of like Southeast Asia and Africa, again, because they had a lot of resources for the Europeans to use. The third thing, now here's what's twisted. The third thing is that the Europeans wanted new markets to sell all of the stuff that they were now making, right? So think back to what we were just talking about self-sufficiency. They wanted to be able to make things on their own without having to pay for it, right? Because if they overtook Zimbabwe that had a lot of minerals, then that meant they weren't going to have to pay Zimbabwe to get those resources, because I've overtaken Zimbabwe and now I own Zimbabwe, so now I'm not going to have to pay for those resources. However, for reason number 3, the Europeans wanted to make a profit off of the stuff that they were now making. Okay, so if we're using that example, I just got all of my resources, my minerals from Zimbabwe to make new, what did I make? Maybe I made some new necklaces, okay? But now I have Zimbabwe to go sell my stuff to, okay? So the new markets really just meant that they were going to sell to more people, okay? Even though that Zimbabwe was technically a part of whatever country I was in, right? Whatever European country I am, they still turned right around and sold the stuff that they were making to the lesser developed countries, okay? So to the colonized places. And so that's what's messed up, is that they would take the stuff from the poorer countries, but then they would sell it right back to them instead of giving it to them, right? They wanted a different market. They wanted more people to sell their stuff to so that they could make more money, okay? The fourth reason that the Europeans went abroad was because they wanted to share their faith. Okay, that's what missionary motives means, really, that they just wanted to share their faith. And we know that this is Christianity, right? And we looked at that a couple of slides ago, how they wanted to make more converts, right? And so that's why they started sending missionaries along on these trips to new parts of the world, because they wanted to share and spread their faith. And so that's another reason why the Europeans went abroad. The fifth reason is called a white man's burden. Now, this is not to be derogatory at all, but you have to remember that the Europeans were typically all white, okay? And so back during this time period, you have to think 1800s, being white was kind of considered like a top social class, basically, okay? And so when it talks about white man's burden, basically that's just talking about the Europeans feeling like they needed to serve other countries, serve and help poor countries, is really all that means, is that they felt like they had to help these lesser countries by giving them access to Christianity, by helping them make more money, kind of in a twisted way, and to give them a larger, maybe more dominant population. Okay, so it's twisted, but the white man's burden was just their kind of twisted way of thinking that they were actually helping these poor countries. And while partially that's true, while some of these countries did get better or learn certain things to grow from, we know that today most of those colonized countries are not really sitting at the best place as far as like freedom or economically, right? That they are still pretty hindered by the fact that they were colonized for so long. Okay, so it's kind of backwards there a little bit. Lastly, we have nationalism. So when the Europeans went to go take over other countries, this kind of gave them a sense of pride for their country, and so they were kind of proud to be able to go into other countries to do all of these things that are listed here. And so it created maybe a sense of unity for those European countries, that they could unite behind and have a sense of nationalism. All right, so that wraps it up for this lesson today. I do want you to think about how everything that we've talked about with the colonization and imperialism, I want you to think about how that connects to how boundaries are established. And I want you to write that down, okay? So the notes page that you filled out will need to go on your Google folder. If you have any questions, let me know.